So I want to thank you all for coming to my talk. I am more of a technical speaker, but I actually do have a law degree, and I notice the person after in this room also has a law degree, so this is definitely a thing, attorney turned data scientist or software engineer. But you never really leave being an attorney. You always have those concerns and are looking to argue. So this is something I am very interested in, and it's certainly becoming more and more timely. Especially in the EU. I think you all might even know more about this than I do because, of course, working in the US, I continue to work in an area that doesn't have any sort of impending legislation regarding what I do. I want to back out. I know people have sort of differing levels of awareness. Lots of people just don't read the newspaper, and that's fine. And this section in particular is probably mostly for those folks who maybe haven't been paying attention to what's going on and the fact that people who don't code are starting to pay attention to what we do. I want to go all the way back to 2013 when a woman named LaTanya Sweeney, who happens to have a PhD, but I don't think she put that into the Google search, just Googled her name. I think she was, thinking about looking for jobs and thought, well, I want to know what my online profile looks like. My future employers could be Googling me. What do I look like? And what does she see? She sees Google ads, instant checkmate, and the top ad from Google, LaTanya Sweeney, arrested. Not LaTanya Sweeney, PhD, LaTanya Sweeney, arrested. For those, I don't know what the UK context is. Certainly in the US, when I look at a name like LaTanya, I'm fairly sure that's an African American, right? So I think LaTanya fairly said, I wonder if it's something to do with that. I hope not, but maybe it is, right? So, she wasn't happy about this, and so she came up with some names that in the US are more typically associated with Caucasians, like Kristen Sparrow. So if you Google for Kristen Sparrow, we're just looking to contact Kristen Sparrow. We're not checking if Kristen Sparrow has been arrested. Interestingly, if you go to this website that was trying to run these ads, Kristen Sparrow on the bottom actually does have a public criminal record. LaTanya Sweeney doesn't. And yet, who is getting the ad coming up on their name asking if this person has been arrested? The person with the name that is primarily an African American name. So imagine if you are LaTanya Sweeney, PhD, and you find out that Google regards you as LaTanya Sweeney, arrested. It's a little bit upsetting. She went on to write a paper about this, discrimination in online ad delivery, and I think this was really a touchstone moment in a lot of fields of people saying, hey, this seems to have gotten out of hand. There could be some really unpleasant consequences for people in a very sort of biased way. Lots more has been going on, though, right? So we know that discriminatory pricing has always been a thing, but now there are good reasons to think it's more algorithmically driven, right? Rather than individual salespeople or companies being discriminatory, it's probably algorithms maybe that some of us are writing that might be doing this, often unintentionally, right? So people have been looking into how are prices determined on the internet in particular, right? So if you look into it, you find out things like in the US, Asian Americans tend to be charged more money when they're looking into cram schools, right? So again, it's like, let's take a particular minority and do something to them that we're not doing to the majority. I am not saying this is being done on purpose, but when you look at what's happening to them empirically, this is what they're experiencing. More concerning still was a 2016 ProPublica report on a system called Compass. Don't know if you folks have heard of this. Again, mostly American context here. This is a system that is used to sort of rate people who have been found guilty of crimes as far as how likely they are to commit other crimes. And it's mostly supposed to predict violent crime. So in 2014, as early as 2014, then U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder knew about this, and he warned that these risk scores were probably racially discriminatory. There were lots of reasons to be concerned given the underlying data, right? If you take data from a discriminatory system, and often when you look into the U.S. criminal justice system, you do find reasons to worry that it is racially discriminatory. If you are training your models on that, there is good reason, even an attorney who doesn't really have a technical background pointed out, there is good reason to be concerned that you're going to end up with discriminatory results. And actually, he asked the U.S. Sentencing Commission to look into this, but they decided not to. It just wasn't a priority. I wasn't privy to these decisions. I'm just telling you from the outside what we know happened. So ProPublica looked into it, and they found the scores to be pretty crappy. It was not a very good model. It was probably not even a good enough model to roll out in production on Gap.com or Tesco.com. I don't know. These accuracy rates were really not so hot. And the most concerning bit was that the errors tended to fall harshly on African Americans and lightly on Caucasians. So African Americans, when they were misclassified to be violent criminals, or likely to be violent criminals. Labeled criminals turned out to be wrong. On the other hand, when the algorithm went wrong on whites, it was to be too gentle and say, this person is fine, and then they would go on to commit crime. So they had sort of the same error rate, but the error went in different directions. What other sorts of things have been happening? Well, apparently the Jew or not Jew app, I mean, maybe I'm an American and I'm really uptight. This made it onto the French Apple Store way back in 2011. This was designed by humans. So you say, okay, well, those are racist humans. What does that have to do with algorithmic stuff? Well, then we sort of moved into stuff that was sort of more algorithmic. So Microsoft came out with a patent asking to help people navigate around dangerous neighborhoods. And again, in the US context, everybody said, well, when you say dangerous neighborhoods, do you really mean you're navigating around maybe African American neighborhoods? Is that sort of the easier way to do this problem? And so then you sort of get into a human bias in the data sets moving into how you're training your algorithm, even though you probably don't intend it, even though none of those words are in the patent description. I'm sure none of the researchers meant it that way, but they weren't thinking about the sociology. Fast forward to July 2016. Anyone remember Pokemon Go? People started noticing there aren't any of those, I don't even know what they're called, the little things you're supposed to slay. They somehow don't show up in neighborhoods of color. You have to go to white neighborhoods to play this game. Even though I assume those things were sort of placed algorithmically, somehow it sort of stays away from the neighborhoods of color. So that we have sort of more unintentional algorithmic discrimination rather than the human discrimination we started with. But then in November 2017, we come back to human-driven discrimination. This is a dating app that was released for the App Store in Singapore. Facially, they're just saying we help you connect with high-quality people, but apparently on Facebook they were using racially coded language like no maids, no Banglas, unpleasant stuff. And you think all of these apps passed the Apple Human Interface Guidelines, which say we need safety, we can't have objectionable content, but apparently all these are fine. So this is just to point out that looking at industry regulating itself, sometimes you have results that I think, at least in 2018, a lot of us say, this gives me pause. More going on, though, right? Biased algorithms are everywhere, and no one seems to care. That seems to be the latest headlines. And in particular, I have a quote from somebody who runs like a machine learning auditing and fairness consultancy, who's a really famous person who wrote a best-selling book about the subject, Cathy O'Neill, if you've heard of her. She says she has no business. So even though this is getting really popular in the news, nonetheless, nobody's calling up Cathy O'Neill to say, how could we avoid being discriminatory? Even though every time people look into models, they tend to, again, unintentionally, not on purpose, have some kind of discriminatory impact on some kind of minority or vulnerable population. What else has been going on? The White House has issued 2 reports on big data and AI. The first one was in 2015. The second one was December 2016. Needless to say, those were President Obama. We haven't actually seen subsequent work from the Trump administration. But people were concerned about this in the last administration. It is finally beginning to be something businesses are thinking about. This is probably partly related to I think, this election news, more discriminatory things coming to the surface. People are finally becoming aware that these impact their lives. So McKinsey put out a report talking about the business reasons to avoid discrimination in your modeling and sort of the big steps you can take to avoid it. First one is refrain from asking questions whose answers will be invalidated by algorithmic bias, right? Know the limits of your model. Don't ask a question that your model can't really answer, especially without answering in a discriminatory way. Secondly, you need to shape your data samples in such a way that you minimize bias, right? So you need to start taking ownership for your data. You can't just say, that's what the data says, right? You can't go into a discriminatory situation that's been discriminatory in the past and just say, well, since that's how it was, it's not really my thing. And thirdly, they also say that executives, so probably not us, more people who aren't coding so much, should also know when to use and not to use machine learning algorithms. Now, the way I see it, the people in this room, most of us anyway, are largely responsible for these first two, but we also have to remember that we're all usually at some level up answering to someone who doesn't code, right? And so we also need to be able to explain the limitations, which means we need to take some ownership. More things have been going on. Well, this is just an unreadable slide. I just typed in artificial intelligence New York Times, so presumably these are some of their most read or most linked to articles recently. And if you can't read it too well, but I would say that 80% of them are about algorithmic bias. It's just sort of that easy to spot. Reporters can pick it up. So people are getting interested in regulating this. In the US, I think we are definitely behind, sort of timeline-wise, the EU. We are sort of on the national level just looking to define AI and define what algorithmic intelligence or automation should be, just a legal definition. So we have funded a task force to do that, and that was sort of late last year. That's as far as we've gotten. In the US, what we are seeing, though, is there are local legislative efforts. So, for example, my hometown, New York City, it's just a city, but we're also one of the biggest cities. We've got 8 million people just within the city limits, very liberal, sort of activist jurisdictions. So actually, a New York City councilman in December of 2017 got interested in this, and he said, all of these city services are being allocated algorithmically. The city is paying vendors to sell us products, to tell us how to make decisions, but at the same time, they don't give us the source code, and they don't really tell us even what data sets they trained on. I'm a little concerned about this, and especially he is a person of color from the Bronx, so of course he's saying, I in particular am worried that my constituents, who are mostly from minority communities, are in some way being treated worse than they otherwise would be with these algorithms. So I would like to see some code. He got some pushback, and what ended up happening is instead of the legislation he wanted, which was to just see the code, I want to see it, you have to disclose it if it's used in city services, we have, again, a task force to sort of look into what we can do. And of course, there is going to be pushback from industry not wanting to share proprietary data sources or proprietary code, which is, of course, totally legitimate. So we are still, and in the US, seeking a balance or figuring out where we would even begin to start addressing this problem. On the other hand, in the EU, you guys know all about this, and my understanding is this is about to really become a thing, and you are about to have a presentation right after this one about how that is going to affect you. So I'm actually curious if by a show of hands people could say, is this something that you are talking about at work? Is this something that's modifying your workflow? Raise your hand if yes, and raise your hand if no. Okay, so very few are not affected. Now, when I ask this question in US presentations where there isn't some legal rule coming into force, creating liability and creating the option to have some insight into what is going on for the average person, nobody raises their hand. There are not really ethics discussions. There are not regulatory discussions. There is not auditing. That has been my experience with audiences and in my work experience. So I don't know what the general mood in this room is about this legislation. I did find this Center for Data Innovation report about this EU legislation coming out. And I noticed some of the reasons they were fighting regulation, which sound very familiar to the reasons I hear in the US. For example, requiring companies to manually review significant algorithmic decisions raises the overall cost of AI. And the right to explanation could reduce AI accuracy. The right to erasure could damage AI systems. The prohibition on repurposing data will restrain AI innovation. These might all be true, but what I see here that concerns me, especially as an attorney, is I don't see any sort of risk-benefit, and that is what is often missing from an unregulated industry, and that is what has been missing in our industry to some extent. You don't have to balance. You don't need to say, well, my algorithm will be less accurate or more costly to develop, but will it be fairer, or will it ruin fewer people's lives or ruin fewer people's days even? And so I think what is going to happen is we're going to see a shift in all of our industries we're working in, where instead of just saying what would be really cool or what would be amazing or how do we get that data set, people will hopefully begin to say, well, yeah, but there's also a cost and we need to incorporate that, right? Rather than everything being an externality, we're going to see that these costs get integrated in, not necessarily a bad thing. And I would point out that a lot of these complaints that people have sound very similar to other industries, sort of R&D type industries, and they're all thriving. For example, pharma, right? Or aviation. When they first started to be regulated, they said, you know, you're going to kill us. And actually, everyone's doing great. So keep that in mind. More nefarious bloopers few of us know about, right? Not everything makes it into the news, not at all. So I can share a personal story, for example. I read a Crunchbase story about a company that had started predicting loan defaults, and I think it was for student loans in particular. And they profiled sort of the genius young people who were doing this, and good for them, I bear no ill will. But they said, oh, we figured out this really cool thing. People who have to change their phone numbers often default on their loans, and we think there is just something kind of irresponsible about people who change their phone numbers. And I had just changed my phone number. And so I was really upset. And I was even more upset because I had changed my phone number because I was being harassed by somebody. And so this made me think, oh, I was a vulnerable person being harassed, and that would actually impact my credit score, even though I've always paid my bills on time. So I think if you all sort of read the news, you'll probably all find something that applies to you. And then it begins to feel a little more personal. And of course, there are the things we don't even know about. Okay, so we all want to be fair, right? So why do we even have to have this discussion? Well, I think we all have general rules that we all think we agree about, right? Like treat everyone equally. That seems like the default, unless we have some reason not to. And then I run into things like this on Reddit. Like you can very easily find out that Target, which is this big store in America, takes the same shoelaces for women and for men, literally the same SKU, and they put an extra sticker on the women's just so they can charge them more. So it's literally the same packaging. It arrives at the store, they put the extra sticker on the women, and they put it in a different section. And you will only find this out if you go to the men's section and the women's section. And I feel like someone did like a deaf female markup, and like their boss was just like, try to maximize your profit, and we have figured out that women will pay more than men, so let's let them pay more than men, right? And I don't know. I don't really know what the answer is, right? Is it good that if people are willing to pay more, they should pay more, or if they've been trained to pay more, they should pay more? Well, maybe and maybe not. But this I am 99% convinced came out of somebody writing a function to figure out exactly what the markup should be and look at the data, right? So think about how this is getting into people's work lives fairly quickly. Also, if you are going to discriminate, you usually want to do it for a reason, right? Like, for example, we treat children differently from adults, but we actually have a reason, right? They might kill themselves if we leave them unsupervised. On the other hand, we don't tend to sort of give different adults different rules, right? We say we're all competent. Often what will happen with unintentional discrimination, if you have things where people make a requirement that's not really necessary, but it somehow impacts one group of people more than another. A very common example in the US was requiring a high school diploma for jobs that really did not require a high school diploma. And effectively what was happening is the high school diploma was being used as a proxy for race, especially in the south of the US, sort of pre-civil rights era, when it was very difficult for a person of color to get a high school diploma. And so there was a very famous US Supreme Court case. They found this power company. You could start any job without a high school diploma, but you couldn't sort of transfer or advance without a high school diploma, even though the jobs you were trying to advance to also had nothing to do with a high school diploma. And what was most nefarious about this is these requirements had been put in just as the civil rights era was beginning. You know, as people of color were beginning to question the limitations in their lives and beginning to say, hey, why don't I ask for a promotion? Why don't I ask for a transfer? This company said, oh, so sorry, you don't have a high school diploma. We'd love to help you, but, right? So there are things like this. Or, for example, the one I just cited, right? Phone number change as a proxy for being harassed, right? Maybe the reason that it's a good predictor of who's going to default is that those people are having trouble in their lives that has nothing to do with their ability to pay or willingness to pay. But it's sort of an easy way to just discriminate in some way, right? You have to make a decision. Why not use this easy variable that you have in your data set? Also, I think we usually all agree we don't want to kick people when they're down, right? That feels unsporting, and yet people without job experience usually can't get a job, can't get the experience, and especially when I haven't worked at like an AI recruiting company. There are tons of them. It's an important problem, but I often worry that people who are developing algorithms at these companies are doing the same thing, are reproducing this difficult job market where people who are down, who don't have the experience, can't even get past the algorithm that is selecting the resumes. And that's something to think about, right? Similarly, former criminals also, right? They get out of jail. Lots of them really do want to restart their lives, don't want to get involved in crime again, and yet they run into the same problem. Oh, you've got a criminal history, right? Like our algorithm, you're done. Like we can't move you forward, sorry. And so people are running into these algorithmic walls. They used to run into human walls. We are basically reproducing those walls or maybe even making them less porous, right? So maybe you used to be a criminal and you would go in and you would say, I know it's really bad, but please, please give me a chance. Now you can't even beg an algorithm, right? It's not a person anymore who might maybe have some give. So that's something to think about. Finally, why does this require research and training, right? This is actually a very complicated area. It is an area of active research. Couple of things. One is that often the data sets themselves are uninterpretable. I grabbed this from some kind of ecology paper, so it has nothing to do with anything sociology, but I have often worked on human data sets that kind of look like this, right? And at least when I initially look at them, I'm like, what conclusion can I draw? Nothing. Or I plot things out. It can be very difficult to look at a model, look at your visualizations, and know that you're discriminating, but there might be something in there. Similarly, most data scientists and analysts have a quantitative educational background and possibly got tracked there very early, especially you guys in the EU. My understanding is once you get to university level, you're just quant. At least in the US, we sort of like, you do a little quant, maybe one English class on the side, but I get the impression it's a very tracked educational system. And what that means is many of us have a limited sociological educational background, right? We haven't done a whole lot of reading about social problems, right? That's another degree course. We don't have time for that. Totally valid, but means that we might not be aware of the complexities of the models, of the situations we're trying to model. And for all these reasons, it can be difficult to spot when you are unintentionally discriminating, especially in wide data sets. This is an example I'm going to come back to later, but I think we can look at this and say, there's like 17 white guys and 3 white women. This might have been the outcome of something that was somewhat discriminatory, depending on where we were drawing from. Okay, so how are we going to decide what actually is discriminatory, right? We can debate this forever. We can have like little 3 a.m. discussions. What's really interesting for researchers is to just let the law drive the decision, right? The law has already made a decision about what discrimination is. Let's go out and find that, right? That's where society has come to some kind of conclusion about what things should be happening and what things shouldn't be happening. And that's already difficult to find, difficult to prevent. There's 2 definitions, and these are active in the EU and in the US. It's sort of the same lingo. First is disparate treatment, right? This is the really bad one. This is like when you sort of intend to discriminate. You don't see this too often, but it is out there and obviously shouldn't happen. What's much more common is what's called disparate impact. You basically give unfair treatment via unjustified factors that end up making a protected class receive worse treatment. So, for example, the example I gave with the high school diploma, right? Jobs that have nothing to do with high school diploma, you nonetheless put that hurdle there. It tended to be at the time that all the whites got past it and none of the African Americans. So when you look at that, that's disparate impact. Another word for this is called redlining. This comes from US banks used to just pick entire zip codes and give nobody a mortgage in those zip codes. And interestingly, when you looked at those zip codes, on one side of this graphic are the zip codes of people who couldn't get mortgages for their houses, and the other side is African American zip codes. And what do we notice? These are identical maps, right? So this is another example of how you can, in this case, I think this was probably intentional discrimination, but if you are putting zip code into your model quite innocently, you might effectively be doing something very similar to this without having any intention of doing so. So those 2 definitions very much match, for example, 2 of the App Store apps I talked about. On the left, we've got disparate treatment. Remember, no maids, no Banglas, right? So an intentionally discriminatory app, explicitly so. And on the right, we've got disparate impact, right? Where I am assuming Pokemon Go did not intend not to make this game playable equally by people of all colors, but that is what happened. A couple of other sort of terms people talk about: genuine occupational requirement. This is, are you actually requiring something to be hired that is necessary? And if you're working, for example, for a recruiting AI firm, something like that, this is something that will affect you. You should be aware that genuine occupational requirements change over time, right? As society changes, our idea of what's necessary to do a job also changes. And I say that only to remind you that when you are putting requirements in your algorithms, ask yourself whether they are really necessary or that's just something you're used to and you've always done. And a good example of this is the armed forces in the US. The armed forces in the US were segregated even as late as World War II. Somehow people said, oh, if we combine everybody, there are going to be race riots. Like, we can't do it. We can't work that way. So one sort of occupational requirement was you had to be in a unit of the same race. Then up until 2015, women were technically not able to combat, they could not be in combat roles. And even as they said that, lots of American women were out in villages in Afghanistan or Iraq doing combat work, but not getting combat pay. That's actually what ended up happening, because they needed women to talk to the women there, so they had to go. But if they were killed not in action, and that has significant repercussions for your family and for what kind of pension your family will receive. Similarly, the transgender ban in the US military was justified as, oh, we can't really operate this way, it just can't work. And that ended up getting lifted too. So over the last century, we have seen sort of our idea about what is required change. How does this apply to our field? Well, one of these things is the success of the whiz kid entrepreneur, right? There's this idea that you have to be young, that maybe you have to be a certain gender or a certain race to do tech. When people look into this empirically, it's not actually true. And so this is an example when you wonder how people are deciding who gets funding, or even how algorithms are deciding what startups are promising. Are they even looking at the right factors? Another set of language that is helpful, the group underrepresentation principle. So I showed you this picture before. This picture on the left is the board of the New York City subway. What does the New York City subway look like when you actually take it? It looks more like this. This is what I see when I get on the subway. Actually a lot more crowded, but it's very diverse. It's very ethnically diverse. So I was fairly shocked when I saw this picture. This is not an algorithmically selected group of people, but this is a group of people that were sort of selected from different sources. So every organization gets to pick one person. They don't get together and tend to discriminate, but they all, sort of put people into a pool, and this is what happens. So for example, if you have some sort of algorithm that's maybe sharing with other algorithms and other groups, you might have something like this happen. And in fact, this is sort of what happened at Facebook as well, right? A not super diverse group of people. Burden of proof and situation testing. So how do you look for discrimination? Traditionally, the law likes to really prove discrimination. We like to prove you started with one person and another, and the only difference between them was something that's not supposed to matter, right? They have identical resumes, except one is a person of color and one is not, or one is a woman and one is not, or one is heterosexual and one is not. And you want to be able to prove as tightly as you can that this truly was intentional discrimination, or unintentional, but nonetheless discrimination. So here's an example actually from Donald Trump's housing project that he owned in Queens, where the Department of Justice, this was back in the 70s or 80s, sent people in, people who were white and people who were not white, sort of similar income, similar references from their landlords. Somehow all the people who were not white, there just weren't any apartments available. So this is an example of situation testing. How does this apply in our world? Well, interestingly, in the US right now, it is technically illegal to look for discrimination in online algorithms. So you are a researcher, you want to find out if, filling your favorite website is discriminating. I think people do this website, but technically on the books we have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which says that if you provide false information to a website, which you would have to do to do discrimination research, that is actually a criminal offense. The second offense, right, so if you do it once, and then you do it a second time, the second offense is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. So right now there's ongoing litigation with researchers saying, we can't even look for discrimination because it is technically a crime. And while no one has gone to jail for this, the fact that you could is awfully scary. So a couple of concepts there that are pretty interesting. Obviously, this has been noticed by the legal community. There are lots of different ways to sort of look for discrimination. A very popular one is the Rubin causal model, where you try to look at the individual level. If I take one individual and the only thing I tweak about them is the protected thing that's not supposed to matter, and my outcome changes, I have a problem. That's sort of the simplest version. This is the easiest way you can already audit your own work, right? If you are doing a model and you just change the gender or the race of the individual you are modeling and your outcome changes drastically, you should be concerned. So I don't think we have much more time.
You have like 1 minute more because we started late.
Yeah, so we started late. I'm going to skip this section and just go straight to some specific things about your workflow. So data discovery. You want to be aware that biased sampling and sampling contexts are really prevalent, especially in areas where people are doing high-stakes modeling. Criminal data sets, for example, are often collected as a result of police action. If your enforcement is biased, of course your sampling is going to be biased. Worse than that, if the enforcement is not just biased in terms of the rate, but creates different stressors, for example, the police rough up a certain gender or a certain race more than they rough up other genders or races, the way people react is also going to be different. If you're predicting low incidence events, and many of us do because these are the things that are really catastrophic or really profitable or whatever, we're generally working with really meager data sets, so we usually use supplementary data. What happens there? Well, for example, that system COMPAS that I told you about that tends to mislabel black people as guilty and white people as not guilty, as it were, was built to predict sort of violent crimes like murder that are low incidence. How did they do it? They supplemented their data with lots of non-violent crime. And so they used that supplementary data from non-violent crime coming from possibly biased police enforcement, and that might explain part of why they have such sort of racially inflected errors. So you want to ask, are your supplementary data, when you need to use them, introducing an unjustified bias into the actual event you want to predict? You also want to think about underweighting or overweighting protected groups. Many machine learning algorithms are going to favor your majority behavior. You want to be aware of that because minority groups might not behave the same way. Your function is not necessarily monotonic across all your bins. So individuals might be penalized just because you don't have enough data sets like them. Here's an example. In US polling analysis, anyone who's not white, that's just their category. Like, you can be an African American male, and that's sort of as detailed as you get. Whereas whites get broken down into like white, 40 to 50, educated suburban woman, just because there's more data about those people. But what that ends up meaning is certain individuals get much more sort of tailored, accurate treatment than others just because of their race. What can you do about this, right? You can be aware, but what if you've only got biased data? Data massaging. You can effectively relabel to make your world better. How do you do this? You literally change the labels. When you can identify, for example, people in the protected group who were most egregiously discriminated against, you can actually flip the labels on some of them and give them the more favorable outcome, for example, that they ought to have had. Or take away the favorable label from some of the favored group that shouldn't have had that label. So you can do that. You can reweight your data. So you can say, okay, I'm going to find in the deprived group the people who weren't discriminated against. I'm going to weigh them more and try to sort of underweight the people who were discriminated against because I don't want my model to redo that same behavior. You can also do corrective sampling, same idea. One important idea is to know that the tension between fairness and accuracy is not nearly as great as is sometimes implied, right? So sometimes people say, oh, you can be fair, but your model is going to be terrible. That's actually not true. There's a lot of research in this. So all these things on the left are different sort of fairness algorithms people are trying to develop. What you will notice is you can cut your discrimination, and there's lots of ways to measure this, by a factor of 8, right? From 16% to 2%, while only cutting your accuracy from 86% to basically 84%. So imagine if you're making a decision like who goes to jail for a long time and who gets to go home and take care of their family, and you can get rid of all your discrimination and maybe only let one extra criminal go free. I mean, that might be a good trade-off, right? So this sort of accuracy, fairness trade-off is not really the trade-off people say it is. I will just finish my modeling section. So checking your model for discrimination, really basic things. Sometimes you might have assumptions in there, you don't even realize you have them until it's too late. So for example, in 2008, when they sort of did the postmortem, they found that a lot of banks had models after the financial crisis, or before the financial crisis, that didn't even allow for negative changes in housing prices. Somebody thought they should just have a variable that could only go positive. I mean, that's not even easy to program, but somehow people thought it was that obvious, thought it was true. So think about whether your models have built-in constraints that suggest confirmation bias or stability bias. Throwing in lots of variables is actually dangerous, right? It's something we're all inclined to do. We have more and more algorithms actually designed for wide data sets, and yet the wider your data set, the more likely you are discriminating, because many of those attributes you're throwing in, maybe just for fun, like zip code, turn out to mostly be predicting race, and that's how it's sort of impacting your outcome. So you don't want to increase your risk of redlining. Finally, how are you choosing your loss function? Are you choosing a loss function that fairly measures the cost of misclassification, or are you choosing a loss function that is computationally efficient regardless of social cost, right? This is where the quant background we all have rather than the sociology background might be a disadvantage, right? Are you thinking about the true cost to everybody involved? And are you treating all misclassifications the same, even though some are more costly than others, right? You don't want to assume symmetry. And are you applying the same loss function across a variety of populations or cultures without domain knowledge? So I will end there since we are out of time. Anyone who's interested in my slides, please just shoot me an email and I will send them to you. There's more concrete guidance, including also some links to really concrete guidance as to how you can implement this at work.
Do we have a microphone? Yes.
Hey, so there's lots of different ways that, like policies of fairness that you can consider, which favor different metrics or different approaches. Do you think that you could say that there's like one sort of best fairness policy for all, or is it for each group and individual to define a fairness policy which is best suited to their usage?
So firstly, what constitutes discrimination tends to be legally established. So if your organization's goal is to not discriminate in the legal sense, that tends to be fairly well defined, and that's going to be just looking at sort of group level. But of course there are, for example, individual level fairness concerns also, right? Am I arbitrarily punishing some individuals? Maybe not even on the basis of some protected category like race. Maybe just, my algorithm is not as sort of stable as I would like it to be. And that's something where your individual organization has to decide sort of what decision are we making, what's going to hurt people the most.
One more question.
Hey, thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering, you mentioned, that we essentially had human decision makers who had biases and now they're just being moved into the algorithmic world. I just wonder, are you optimistic that algorithms can improve the situation in future if we do it properly? Like does a right way exist, or even if it doesn't at the moment?
I absolutely think a right way exists. I am a big proponent of transparency and having data sets and algorithms be as open as possible where possible, because to me, people go back and forth on this and they say, well, in the past it was, racially biased judges handing down the sentences, and that's just as horrible as a racially biased algorithm. On the plus side, the judge had to actually write a decision that you could challenge, whereas right now, Compass just shoots out a score that you can't challenge. But a judge can also sort of lie or massage their reasons, right? The reason that they say, which might even be the reason they believe, might not really be the explanatory reason. With an algorithm, if you can see everything that's going on, and if it's reasonably interpretable, which is its own problem, then you can see and correct what's going on. So I think it is the way forward, but I truly believe only with the right regulation, because I think what we have seen is people don't tend to disclose without this compulsion. And why should they, right? It's a competitive marketplace. But if you have the right legal regime that favors both innovation and fairness, I think you can strike a very good balance.
And the last question, because we have to.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, if I do something wrong as a person, I discriminate, then I would be punished, let's say. What's about then the programmers who do this algorithm, who's going to be judged at the end of the day? So if I, as a programmer, do something silly and I come up with this algorithm that does discriminate, and it was basically my fault, but no. What do you think about that?
So I think that we actually belong to a profession that does have an obligation to the end users of our programs. I hope that profession like whatever you want to call yourself, data scientist, software engineer, analyst, however you identify, just like other white-collar professions have a fiduciary duty or some sort of like duty to the people who are using their products. I think we have that. I would like to see it formalized, just like, for example, doctors and attorneys have it formalized, to say, yes, we have a professional responsibility to think about these people. I think Europe tends to go farther than the US. For example, my understanding is that, not that it's common, but airline executives can go to jail if a plane crashes and it turns out that they were doing shoddy work. That wouldn't happen in the US. And I don't think it really happens here that often. So I don't really want to see people going to jail because they unintentionally wrote discriminatory algorithms. But I think what happens right now is often there's a business bottom line, and possibly your supervisor is not that interested in these questions because we all have a bottom line, right? We need to pay for our salaries. We need to keep our organization growing. I think what happens is when you put it into the law and it becomes a requirement, then people talk about it. If it's not a requirement, there's just somehow never time to worry about it because there are always business priorities. So I think we want to shift it just to give people the room and the obligation to think about this and audit their model rather than having to push the model out the door as soon as it's reasonably accurate without knowing whether it's discriminatory. So I think we have a duty, but not in the sense of I want people punished or something like that.
Thank you. Let's find the speaker.